we are Group 9, and we'll be doing our presentation on creating a backdoor with a Raspberry Pi Zero with Wi-Fi capabilities. The members in our group are Angelo, Mario, Kenneth, Kinder, and Kazim. So I'm just going to start off the presentation with a bit of general information exactly how you can create a backdoor with a Raspberry Pi. Essentially how you do that is by using a utility called P4wnP1. It's essentially a USB customizable attack, very similar to Rubber Ducky or a Arduino that is able to run a Rubber Ducky scripts. The only difference is instead it's based on Raspberry Pi Zero or Raspberry Pi W if you do want to have the Wi-Fi capabilities with it. So essentially P4wnP1 or your Raspberry Pi with P4wnP1, it can do a wide variety of things like creating a reverse shell on your system, which essentially allows the attacker to open a shell on the target's computer. You're also able to do a Wi-Fi SSH session due to the Wi-Fi capabilities of the Raspberry Pi. In addition to that, you can do other things like a stealthy Bluetooth connection and HID backdoor. And another thing you can do is file gathering. An example of this is kind of like once you connect your Raspberry Pi to the targeted computer, you're able to steal essentially browser credentials that the user has saved in their browser by dumping essentially what's on the browser into a file and copying it directly onto the Raspberry Pi. Another few things you can do that I haven't listed on this slide is you can essentially lockpick Windows 10 boxes that have weak passwords, which is automatic. You can also relay USB attacks over the Wi-Fi and also essentially do keystrokes and copy whatever a user is typing. So what are the security risks of this utility or for P4wnP1? Well, it's very unpatchable. It's very hard to kind of get rid of since it's essentially attacking a port that the whole wide world uses. It's also very discreet since you kind of can plug in a USB and nobody will suspect a thing. You can ask a friend, hey, can I, transfer some files onto your computer or get some files off your computer, and nobody would notice. Again, as I said previously, the shell access target, which again, like once you have access to a shell, you can pretty much, the whole world is your oyster. And yeah, essentially anything on a target window computer is at risk due to the high customizability of the P4wnP1. So essentially who it impacts is kind of hard well, it's not hard since it's essentially everybody, since anybody who kind of owns a Windows 10 or Windows 7 PC is susceptible to this attack.
What impact? The P4wnP1 backdoor attack directly affects the victim system, in particular users running Windows 7 or Windows 10. On the victim side, it looks like a Python shell is being downloaded, not knowing that a reverse shell is being initiated. This attack puts the target system at a huge risk because it gives the attacker control of the system. The victim doesn't notice any adapter or communication device connected because P4wnP1 enables covert backdoor shell access to the target via Wi-Fi. Once the attacker gains access, they can do the following: send malware, execute malicious events, modify firewall settings, or even steal system files. Depending on the environment for which the target is operating in, the consequences of the attack may differ. For example, personal or business, individual and organizational impact. The P4wnP1 backdoor attack is one that can cause severe damage to an individual or business. Because it uses a covert backdoor to reach the target, it is very difficult to detect and remove once the attacker gains remote access. Below is a breakdown of potential consequences it may pose on an individual and a business. Individual. Loss of personal information or files can cause damage to the operating system, can cause personal embarrassment, and can also result in identity theft. In a business environment, it can cause the loss of sensitive business information that can result in damaged reputation, can cause interference to business transactions, can cause the business to go bankrupt, and can also cause network downtime.
Moving on to our technical discussion, I'll be going into detail of our chosen exploit by speaking about why these inherent vulnerabilities exist, how it works in detail, and how it can be leveraged. Our PownPy can work due to the underlying security vulnerability presented by USB hubs. Universal serial buses, also known as USBs, are universal port and communication protocols to connect devices to our computers. They typically have underlying firmware that is not accessible by the target computer or device, as this is what allows the device to function. And we know that there is a subset of these USB devices known as human interface devices or HIDs, and this consists of keyboards, mice, touchscreens, webcams, etc. And in an average setting, most organizations will go out of their way to restrict storage devices, but not HIDs, as they're fairly essential within the organization. And in more technical setups, at a minimum, a keyboard or a mouse may be required in order to set up or utilize a certain device. So how can this be leveraged? Well, if we disguise our PownPy as an HID keyboard, we can perform custom keystrokes, such as Windows R, and launch programs such as PowerShell, command line, or any other application that we please. And this opens up many, many doors as an attacker. So, how does PownPy create a backdoor? How does this all work? There are 4 main components that I'll go over. First, in the initial setup configuration, setup.config, the device is configured as an HID keyboard to carry out keyboard attacks. So when the device is plugged in initially into the target machine, it will be recognized as a keyboard. Next, it utilizes the HID backdoor payload to create a generic HID to tunnel shell inputs. This contains 4 components. There is a generic vendor ID, a generic product ID, and a keyboard layout. It is imperative that this keyboard language is set to the same as the target's layout, or this will not work. An example would be if the target's keyboard layout was in Japanese, and our keyboard layout was in US, this would result in a misconfiguration, and our attack will not carry forward. And lastly, and most importantly, the screen command will create an HID server with an active screen session, will launch a Python script, and it will await for further instructions from the attacker. Next, and this will be displayed in our demo, the attacker will spawn a Wi-Fi AP over PownPy's internal SSH server, and subsequently the attacker will SSH into that SSID via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, depending on what you configured. And this not only provides the attacker access to the target machine, regardless of if it has internet connectivity or not, but the victim will only see the HID device and the generated SSID. And lastly, the attacker will then issue Fire Stage 1 to create a shell via a PowerShell script, and after will use the command shell to access the backdoor shell and send commands. Going into a bit more of a granularity, I'm going to point out a couple notable components that make the PowerShell script and the reverse shell work. So first we have GUID dev interface HID, and this registers the PownPy to the OS of its HID collections presence, which then allows the grouping of HID controls and usages. This allows us to execute our malicious keystrokes, and when we looked up this set GUID on Microsoft's Hardware Dev Center, we got the following. Next is create file stream from the device path, and this provides a file stream to support read and write operations. And next, and most interestingly, there is redirect standard input and output, and this is called from client process.cs, and this is set to true. And this is used to communicate with the operating system shell and to start any sort of processing. So the command below will show an example of our std in, and it will take any process, send it to the operating system shell, and encode it in UTF-8, and send it via our covert communications channel that is set up by our generic HID. So why does this work at a granular level? Well, inherently, PowerShell supports WMI and .NET frameworks, and this boasts incredible ease of use, and we can execute these PowerShell commands remotely. And as trusted binaries and precompiled netcode are injected at runtime, they neither go to disk, and it does not trigger the antivirus present on the machine. As a result, this creates a very small footprint. Now that I've covered the basic and core components of our P4wnP1, we'll delve much deeper and provide a live example in our technical demo.
To start on this demonstration, we require a couple of devices, and I'll give a short explanation of why. First one being the Raspberry Pi 0W. The USB port allocated on the Pi is able to emulate a human interface device. This means that we are given certain trusts by operating systems, and as operating systems cannot differentiate whether it is Joe Blow typing away at superhuman speeds versus a script that is outputting keystrokes artificially, this is inherently exploitable. Recently, a new type of human interface device exploit vector has come into play. This is now called WHID, with the W standing for wireless. With the advent of better Bluetooth sensors and reliability improving, we see wireless mice and keyboards everywhere, which are vulnerable to injection. However, in our case, we are using Wi-Fi with the Raspberry Pi Zero wireless edition to transmit an access point for us. It comes preloaded on the SD card, and it contains Raspbian with P4wnP1 installed. Next, we need to find a way to connect the Pi to the victim. One way is to install a USB hat extension for the Pi, which makes it inconspicuous. However, for our demonstration, we will be using a simple micro USB to USB-A to connect to our computer. We also need a Windows device to exploit that has a USB-A port. We will use my laptop with Windows 10 installed. Plus, we need a device that can access the access point spawned by the Pi and has the ability to SSH into the Pi. It works well on my Android phone using the Juice SSH utility. However, for readability and faster configuration, we will use my other laptop. Now that we have that sorted and our Pi plugged in, we have some preparation in order for the P4wnP1 to figure out which payload to run, as there are many variants and vectors of attack. So we plug in the P4wnP1 to the device to power it up, and we should see that it should spawn an access point. As it is a Raspberry Pi device, it takes a bit to bring up the access point. And we will see here in a second that it should come up. And as you see, it has come up. Now that we successfully connected to the access point, we can now connect through SSH into the PwnP using its preset IP address at 172.24.0.1. And it also has a default username of Pi with a password of Raspberry. What we are doing in our demonstration is a HID backdoor. So what we do is we comment out the HID underscore backdoor.txt payload in setup.config, save the file, and we should be ready to go. So we should be able to find setup.config, Pinano, we scroll down, and find that HID backdoor is what we need. So we uncomment this and we exit, and we should be ready to go. We unplug the Pi and plug it into the victim's USB port. And now that that is plugged in, we can see that it has spawned another access point, SSID. Now we can go back and access SSH. And as you see, instead of the usual command line we get, we are met with the PwnP shell CLI. And a simple test we can do to see if keystroke injection is working. We open a notepad and we do a simple command called send keys, and we put anything we want. In this case, we put test. And as you see, it has typed out test, and we are only connected through the Raspberry Pi Wi-Fi. And now to perform a reverse shell, what we do is we use the command fire stage 1. When we input it, it should open up a PowerShell. And as you see, it types out the stage 1 to the target, and now the target is connected through HID covert channel. So now what we do to connect to the reverse shell is we type out shell, and as you see, I am connected to Microsoft Windows version 10, and that is my user. And if I do something like dir, we can see all of the stuff that are in my computer, in my laptop. In conclusion, we see that wireless HID is a very powerful method of exploitation that can be used inconspicuously, especially when a scenario occurs when someone leaves their laptop unattended, or if it's a secure machine without internet access. Overall, there's not much you can do to protect against an attack like this, aside from keeping your wits around you. Once an attacker plugs in a device and SSH through his phone, typing out one command that can easily be automated to run, it's already game over. I foresee that in the future, there will be vectors of attack that are similar to this. Something recent that comes to mind is the Lodge attacker, where a wireless Logitech mouse or keyboard dongle could be intercepted and a similar exploit could be implemented. As it becomes more commonplace, we also find tools that are easy to deploy. We also tested out a version with a graphical user interface implementation. And we didn't have as much control and it didn't work out as well. Say no to GUIs.